there was this need in UK started, and therefore there was a foundation of this COPE, Committee of Publication Ethics, and Chris, in addition to work for Wiley, he's also the deputy director of the COPE. So what better than leave the podium to Chris. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Chris Graf. I'm volunteer at an organisation called COPE, the Committee on Publication Ethics, that was just described to you. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what COPE does and then share some thoughts about peer review. I volunteer at COPE, but I work at Wiley. So, and I have done I've worked in publishing for about 20 years. So I need to explain that it could be considered to be a conflict of interest. I don't think it is. I think it's a confluence of interests. Righto. So, about COPE, a charitable organisation established in the UK nearly 20 years ago. In fact, next year is our 20th birthday. We have about 12,000 members, most of whom are journal editors. But there are some others who are associate members of COPE, for example, David Vaux. And these are some of the things that we do. We provide a neutral place for the difficult things that we've been talking about to be discussed with peers. So if you're a journal editor and you spotted a dodgy figure or something that looks like data manipulation, or there's an intractable authorship dispute and you just don't know what you should do, you can come, anonymise the case and present it to 60 or 70 of your peers, and those who've got similar experiences share theirs and you can work out what to do. So it's neutral, it's professional. Most of what we do is about providing support and education through a website of freely available resources. You can go there and look at them if you like. I'll just draw your attention to one thing on this slide, which is the database of 550 cases, or more than 550 cases. In the time that COPE has been in existence, we've been holding these forums, and people have been presenting these anonymous cases, and we've been writing them up and sticking them on a website. So you can go and read the tricky case that was presented. You can go and read the advice that forum presented and shared back with the editor. And sometimes when there's follow-up, you can read about the follow-up as well, if you're interested. Here are my few slides about peer review. And I'll start with some of the problems. So not only are there problems in data manipulation that need to be spotted, there are also problems in the way that peer review is conducted. This slide speaks to some retractions that were published last year, 260 or thereabout retractions for fake papers and fake peer review. So there's something that we loosely call paper mills or paper milling going on. You can pay an organisation to write a paper for you and get it published. And this was spotted by Biomed Central, some publishers at a publishing house called Biomed Central. And they noticed some irregularities in the peer review process, some email addresses that kept popping up, some peer reviews that were sort of 3 lines long and identical across different papers. And they thought, hold on a minute, there's something funny going on here. And they did a data analysis, not like sort of a computational data analysis, more sort of a simple Excel spreadsheet, and they spotted these errors across a whole number of papers around about a year ago, and that led to 260 odd papers being retracted. So that's not good news. Then only last month, it kind of happened again. Oh, there's a missing slide. It did kind of happen again. A whole load of papers, instead of being faking papers and sort of manipulating the process, there are 60 more papers were retracted. A different group involved here, a group of authors that were kind of cooking the peer review process. They were nominating their friends for as peer reviewers. They were peer reviewing each other's papers favourably, and they were shortcutting the peer review process and getting their papers published. Again, spotted by the great team at Biomed Central, and again followed with about 60 retractions, in fact 58 retractions that were published just at the start of November. So all is not well in the world of peer review. On the fake peer review bit, this is a lady called Elizabeth Moylan, who is also a member of COPE Council, works at Biomed Central, and the 260 retractions were due to agencies manipulating the whole process. The 60 odd retractions that were published earlier this month we're still in November, were due to, as I described, sort of manipulation, fairly complex and sophisticated human manipulation of the peer review process. If you'd like to read about that, there's a, I don't know if you get the slides afterwards, but there's a link there. You can find it on Retraction Watch and read more about it there. So all is not well and healthy in the world of peer review, and yet we still kind of trust it. So these are data from a number of surveys, not particularly recent surveys, 2013, 2011 surveys. And the cherries I've picked from those surveys are that more than 80% of researchers think that without peer review there would be absence of control. And, well, 9 out of 10 cats think that peer review improves the quality of their paper. So even though we know that there's stuff going on that we would really rather isn't going on, we still feel that peer review is serving a useful role. I'm now going to share with you the ethical guidelines for peer review that COPE has published. They were published in 2013 and they're undergoing revision right now. I put them on the slide with a link so you can go and read them in full, but I've kind of summarized them in positive statements here. What COPE suggests is that you accept reviews when you have both the expertise, funnily enough, and also the time to do it. So we really are trying to encourage peer review to happen as quickly as is reasonable to expect. There are a couple of points here about confidentiality and privileged information. So some peer review processes are actually open and they're not confidential, but many peer review processes are somewhat closed at the moment. In fact, the majority of them are. And so if you're being invited to peer review in one of those confidential sort of modes of doing peer review, then it's worth respecting that confidentiality. And also always the information that you see is privileged information. So you shouldn't use it to further your own goals. We talk about declaring conflicts of interest. So if you are best mates with the author or mortal enemies with the author, then you should step back from the peer review process and decline. We say you should be objective, not obstructive, and constructive in your review. Give as much to peer review as you take, so that if you're publishing articles and expect those to be peer reviewed, then you should do peer reviewing as well. We should help journals to know your strengths. So if there is, everybody should be familiar with error bars now. If there is a particular requirement for specialist statistical expertise in the paper that you're reviewing, then you should say this is beyond my area of expertise. You should say this needs specialist review. And last of all, and perhaps kind of relevant here, is something called pass the review. I don't think it's wrong if a PI or a lab head asks one of their team to do a peer review. I do think it's wrong if the PI or the lab head then pretends it's them who's done the peer review. So I'd COPE is suggesting kind of be honest if you are in that situation, and say, listen, this is my review, I did it, and sign it. Have you ever seen a peer reviewer comment like this? Another Hansen masterwork, breathtakingly rich and panoramic, a creative and intellectual volcano. Man, that would be great, wouldn't it? This is a comment on a paper published earlier this year, a climate change paper. The author was called Hansen from Colombia, and it's about ice melt, sea level rising, 2 degrees, superstorms. And so it's clearly an area of a high degree of public interest. Anyhow, the way that the journal that he published this work in, it's called Atmospheric Chemistry and Physics Discussions. The way they do peer review is they put the papers up before peer review, effectively, like a preprint server, effectively. But they also run elements of traditional peer review alongside. So they do, they invite some peer reviewers. This was one of the invited peer reviewers. And they allow other peer reviewers to comment. The paper then goes through a cycle of revisions and is decided that it's final at some stage. So that's interesting. A different mode of peer review, one that can still respect COPE's ethical guidelines, and one that perhaps brings out into the open all of the things that are currently happening kind of like a black box. And last of all, a peer review hero. This is a story that was published on a Nature blog, probably, I don't know, 2 years ago. And that's Pamela Ronald. She's a crop scientist at UC Davis. And this is a story about her finding an error in one of her papers and what she did about it. So it's about publishing and peer review, I suppose. So she published an article on disease resistance in rice. And when she's the head of a lab, right? So she's senior in her career. She knows what's going on, and her career is not at risk. When she tried, or when the people in her lab tried to replicate or reproduce her experiment, they couldn't do it. And at that point, alarm bells started ringing. So Pamela Ronald was concerned about, the stuff that they'd published and who else was using it around the world to build disease-resistant rice programs out of. And was concerned for the people in her lab and their careers if this was a piece of work that should be retracted. So she rang up the editor of Science, or the editors of Science, and said, hey, could be a problem here. I'm going to work it out. Will you bear with me? I bet she didn't ring them up, though. I bet she wrote them an email. And then they went about figuring out what had gone wrong. And so it turned out that the rice samples that they were using, the protein that they thought was missing wasn't missing. So the samples themselves were faulty. And also that the tests that they're running on those samples, they were faulty as well. So there's two times the problem, which was probably a massive relief, I would imagine. And at that point, she knew what to do. She knew that the papers must be retracted, and she knew why they should be retracted. So she worked with the editors to do just that and published a retraction for those papers. But she went above and beyond that, and instead of stopping there like most of us would do, I guess because of the impact of her work, she decided to hold public meetings where she would explain what had gone wrong and communicate more broadly the problems with her work. And I think that's brilliant. I think she's a peer review hero for those reasons alone. She's done something that has, unfortunately, a stigma. Publishing a retraction is stigmatized. People think it's a badge of shame, but it isn't. It isn't if you're doing the right thing. And we need to sort of celebrate people like Pamela Ronald, and there you go. So that's all I've got to say. Thank you very much indeed. If you have any questions, I'm here.